Herman taught for many years at the University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School. Prior to that, he taught at Penn State University. He's written many books, some of which are listed on your program. There's many others that you're probably aware of. He currently edits the magazine called Lies of Our Times, which he brought us some sample copies. Anybody would like to take one. He also writes regularly for Z Magazine, one of the better magazines in America. And he's currently, or in the last year or so, he's taught some courses on media analysis at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And maybe best of all, he's also a member of our group, which is always nice to have. So first we'll have Dr. Ed Herman to accept the award and give us a little message here tonight. Dr. Herman?
I'm a tall guy. I need this loose. Thanks very much, Bob, and I'm very pleased to be the recipient of the award and to be getting it here with my esteemed colleague, Noam Chomsky. My talk tonight is addressed to the question of, does socialism have a future? Socialism has suffered some very severe blows, as you are all aware, in the last few years. Virtually all the world's regimes and experiments that have called themselves socialist have been defeated or removed from power by external or internal political and military processes. This has been a very serious setback for socialists, social democrats, and leftists everywhere. It has terminated experiments that, whatever their weaknesses, many of us had hoped might strengthen over time. It's weakened the barriers to the great capitalist powers' military economic assaults on socialist and social democratic outcroppings in the Third World. And it's badly damaged socialist and left morale and spirit of hope. This set of defeats raises three questions that I want to discuss briefly here. One, was it socialism that was defeated, or systems so far removed from socialism that the word is not at all applicable? Two, why were the really existing socialisms defeated? And finally, is socialism finished, or does it have a future? To answer the first question, in fact, to answer all of them, we must first answer the further question, what is socialism? Most socialists would agree that socialism cannot be an authoritarian or totalitarian order, that it must include a fully democratic mode of political governance. It must also include community and worker ownership and control of major producing assets. And it must embody a strong policy thrust toward both equalitarianism, inclusiveness, and libertarianism. The really existing socialisms have generally not met the first and parts of the second and third conditions. They have been bureaucratic and centrally controlled by a self-appointed vanguard and not libertarian. Their versions of socialism has involved mainly state ownership and control and an equalitarian thrust, plus some socialist rhetoric that was often hypocritical and Orwellian. So the answer to the first question is that a case can be made that socialism has never been tried. The defeated socialisms were at best imperfect socialisms. At worst, they were perverted versions. They were also, however, under steady pressure and sometimes fierce attacks from the West, which weakened the possibilities of improvement. Which brings me to my second question. Why did the really existing socialism suffer such defeat? Of course, very important factors were the conditions under which they arose. Almost all the socialisms of the world came in rather poor countries. They came frequently after wars. They were countries that were not particularly well developed. They were economically. They were countries that had traditions that were not democratic traditions. And so when these governments came into power, these socialist governments came into power, they were always in distressed circumstances. They were always having to recover, to try to mobilize the population to development and to simple recovery. And they had very little managerial talent. And of course, all these things were badly exacerbated by the fact that the West was hostile to them from beginning to end. The force of that hostility, I think, has been greatly underestimated. In fact, in the West, it's a principal idea that has been fostered for many years, is that the West has been on defense against socialism. Socialism has been a threat, that we are containing the West. It presented a challenge to which has required us to defend it. In fact, Professor Chomsky, in his book Deterring Democracy, has a very nice chapter on the Cold War, where he has an excellent discussion of the literature in which it is established that the Soviets, by coming into existence, challenged us. They presented a new idea, they had a potential threat, and therefore many intellectuals and officials have argued that caused us to have to defend ourselves. So everything we did against them, including invading them immediately upon their arrival, was strictly defense. By definition, we were only on the defense. That is straight out of George Orwell. And in fact, the case I am making right at the moment is that the socialist world has been under unremitting attack at all levels. In fact, it was under unremitting military and terroristic attack from the beginning. The Soviet Union itself was invaded before it even existed, and it was attacked subsequently by Hitler in the post-World War II period. As you know, it was encircled, it was under constant military threat, it was under steady military pressure, and in fact the arms race was to a very large extent an American effort that was explicitly designed to impoverish the Soviet Union, to put it under economic pressure as a poorer country. And take all the other socialisms. China, it was attacked immediately after the Civil War. The United States funded the nationalists who were on the Burmese border. They of course protected Chiang Kai-shek. We almost atom bombed China during the Korean War period. So China was under steady warfare. In fact, the Vietnam War itself was considered by China quite plausibly to be a very serious threat to its national security. The great power across the ocean was attacking its neighbor. It was a national security threat. We have had the most marvelous capability of seeing national security threats everywhere to us. But whatever we do, surrounding other countries, attacking their neighbors, is not plausibly a threat to them. They should understand that we are people of goodwill. There also, of course, there have been continuing efforts also at subversion, the use of black propaganda, buying politicians and military personnel. The most famous cases are the ones that I've always been most fond of are Brazil and Chile. In Brazil, the United States practically took over the country, buying newspapers, buying politicians on a huge scale before 1964, buying the army and the police, and ultimately succeeding in getting subversion realized in a military coup that we were really essentially part of. The same thing was true in Chile. We've also carried out continuous economic warfare against all the socialist powers, the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Guatemala, Cuba, Nicaragua. The design of these efforts by the West have been to force increased arms expenditures, to weaken these countries economically, and to force them into the Soviet bloc, to create fear and to curtail liberty. In effect, what we were trying to do all the time was to engage in a self-fulfilling prophecy. We prophesied that these countries were non-libertarian. We were going to darn well help make them non-libertarian. And we wanted them to be Marxist-Leninists, so we would force them into the Soviet camp by boycotting them. Then we would be proving that they had these Marxist-Leninist tendencies and were affiliating with the Soviet Union. We did that time and again. Very important to understand that these efforts of the United States in reference to countries like Nicaragua or Cuba or Guatemala were never to democratize. They were always to destabilize and destroy. We just did not want social democratic and socialist countries. So while we might be attacking Nicaragua for years on the ground that we wanted a more democratic Nicaragua, nobody with any sense whatsoever could possibly fall for that nonsense. We had supported Somoza for 45 years. The same government was proclaiming a deep interest in democracy in Nicaragua, was kindly supporting Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, anybody you might name. So the hypocrisy was absolutely mind-blowing. And the reality was clearly that the Sandinistas represented some, Oxfam study called a threat of a good example. It was an alternative way of organizing economic life. It was not even really socialism, but social democracy. We couldn't bear it. So we used all the means at our power disposal to eliminate that threat. Admittedly, the leaders and the bureaucrats of the Soviet bloc countries performed poorly and lost the respect of their own people, and much of this happened independently of Western policy. But the West exacerbated the worst tendencies of these deficient socialisms, and when they showed signs of some positive changes, the West took advantage of these in the case of the Eastern Bloc with the assistance of significant parts of the old bureaucracies in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to destabilize them and pull them quickly into the Western orbit. In cases like Vietnam, Nicaragua, Guatemala under Arbenz, Chile under Allende, and Juan Bosch's Dominican Republic, even social democracy was never given a chance, but was actively destabilized or attacked. I think it is very greatly underrated the extent to which the triumph of the market and what Clinton is now calling market-based democracies, which are not very democratic, depended on sheer force, violence, and terrorism to achieve their final ends. Does socialism have a future? It's hard to be very optimistic given the recent defeats and the power of the global market system and its enforcers. But there are these several important threads of hope. One is that the market-based democracies are increasingly serving a small elite and marginalizing the majority of people. They're creating what we might call a global reserve army of labor and uncared for people. They are our market, and we have to be prepared to serve them. Furthermore, the fundamental principles of the triumphant market economy, that is possessive individualism, competition, the profit motive is the dynamic of the system, and its basis on enlarging consumption and growth continuously, are incompatible with ecological and environmental reality and human survival. As they fail in these regards, our market will swell further. In an important sense, therefore, the triumph of socialist values is a condition for human survival. This should give us an additional incentive to keep our ideas in play. It even constitutes a kind of moral imperative. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, like our first recipient, as I forgot to mention, is a native of Philadelphia. Dr. Noam Chomsky received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. Many of us first learned of him and his work during the Vietnam War, when he was a very early and very outspoken activist and critic against the war in Vietnam. He's the author of many, many books, only a few of which are listed here. Let me not be spreading disinformation. Dr. Chomsky has never appeared on Nightline. I'm not sure if it has to do something with Ted's toupee or not, but I think it's more of a matter of principle. He was asked to appear and he declined. He's known throughout the world for his work in language and has made contributions to linguistics and psychology, and also, of course, to political and international rights, human rights. And we're very pleased to have him here tonight to accept the Maurer Stump Award.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor. I guess I should explain to you why is this okay? Yeah. Why I wasn't on Nightline. I actually was asked once. There was a study done by Fair, was it? Yeah, Fair did a study on Nightline, asking it just a long analysis of who had been on and who hadn't been on, with the results that you can imagine. And that day, I got a call from the producer of Nightline saying, could I be on the next day? And I said, well, I'm going to be out in Wyoming next day. I can't make it. They said, don't worry, we'll send a team out to Wyoming to interview out there. And I said, no, not under these conditions. I mean, I know what you're up to. You know what you're up to. They also asked me one other time, and this tells you what all of these guys are really about. They asked me, it was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they wanted me to be on. It was perfectly obvious setup. I knew exactly what was coming. And I said, no, I'm not going to be on. A little later, I got a call from my friend Alex Coburn, who you all know, and he said he'd just been asked to be on Nightline, what I think, and I said, you're crazy if you go on, and I told him what I think they're going to do, and he said, oh, well, he would go anyway. And he went, and I don't know if you saw that, he actually wrote an article about it afterwards. They had him sitting there in a room, and part of the deal in Nightline is you can't see Ted Koppel. He can only see you. That's supposed to give him a psychological advantage or something like that. So he was sitting there in whatever room he's in, and they showed a picture of the Berlin Wall falling and people cheering and so on and so forth. And then they went over to him and they said, well, Mr. Coburn, what do you have to say about that? And he said, well, wait a minute. Tried to get a sentence in. You're allowed about 2 sentences. And after his 2 sentences, they said, thank you, Mr. Coburn. And then they went over to the head of the Communist Party or something like that. That's Nightline. Ed and I have been working together for years. Had a joint book published 20 years ago, which succeeded in putting the publisher out of business when the corporation didn't like it, and closed down the publisher to prevent it from being distributed, and a lot of water under the bridge since then. And we kind of divide the turf, more or less. He was talking about the future of socialism, so I guess I had to talk about the future of capitalism and democracy, or the future of capitalist democracy, or for that matter, the past of capitalism. Actually, speaking about the past of capitalism could be an extremely short talk because it has no past. It's been tried occasionally in the rich countries. There are brief experiments with capitalism. They're very quickly called off by the business community because no one in the business community wants to subject themselves to the ravages of the market. So the only places so they call in a powerful state to intervene and protect them and so on. There are a few places where capitalism indeed has been tried. For example, in the last 10 years, there are 76 countries that have undergone structural adjustment programs. That's real capitalism. Every one of them is a complete disaster. There's the constant property that all of them have is that labor's share in the economy, the share of working people and economic product is declining rapidly. And in fact, that's the point. To the extent that market systems are applied, it's in weak countries, weak defenseless countries, and it is imposed essentially to make them even more defenseless. These market experiments that are imposed on the poor countries, 76 of them in the last decade, they go right back to Britain in the 18th century. The first major such experiment was in Bengal, which was conquered by Britain in the mid-1757. They imposed an experiment in market economies with total disaster. This was one of the richest areas in the world at the time, competitive with England. Within a 50 or 60 years, it was destroyed. Now it's Bangladesh. And that's what happens when capitalism is tried. And since rich people understand that, they know perfectly well it's not for them. Any lingering illusions that capitalism might be a viable system were finished by the 1930s. And since then, there has been no experiment with it in the rich countries or with markets, except when you can get temporary advantage. Then, there'll be brief periods when people will talk about markets. Well, what about capitalist democracy? It's supposed to have a big future. In fact, that's one of the shibboleths of the day. So the chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, otherwise known as the State Department spokesman at the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, right after the Gulf War, had an article talking about the grand future ahead of us, and he said that America's victory in the Cold War is a victory for a set of principles, democracy and the free market. The world is coming to understand that the free market is the wave of the future, a future for which America is both the gatekeeper and the model. That word gatekeeper has a kind of an ominous ring to it. And I want to say a couple of words about how we keep the gates and who we let in and what kind of a model we intend to offer for the world, or for that matter for ourselves, which is interesting, I think. This has moved from front pages of the New York Times to national policy in the last couple of days. This week there were the announcement of this new Clinton doctrine. Every president has to have a doctrine, and the Clinton doctrine was announced 5 or 6 days ago. It was, or a week ago, I guess, by Anthony Lake, the National Security Advisor, in a major address, which was written up all over the press. It starts like this. I'll just read the first sentence. Throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracies, and now we should seek to enlarge their reach. So up until now, it was containment of a threat to global democracy. Now it's enlargement of capitalist democracy, of market democracy. Well, that's pretty impressive. In fact, the headline in the New York Times said, "Vision of foreign policy reversed." Not just changed, but reversed. So really big story. Well, if a rational person wanted to know what, let's say an enemy, Soviet Union, was trying to do in the world, what they were trying to do in the world, suppose you're rational, what you would ask is, what in fact did they do in places where they could influence things? And that's the obvious question. 10-year-old can figure that out. Similarly, if you want to find out what the U.S. tried to do in the world during this past period of containment, the obvious question to ask is, what did the U.S. leadership do in places where they had influence? Now that's a much bigger region to test than the Soviet Union, which was a small power. But the obvious place to look is where the influence was greatest. And the influence was, of course, greatest in Latin America. Latin America is the one place where the United States was able to impose its image and its vision literally without impediment, especially after the Second World War, when the rivals of the United States, Britain and France, were unceremoniously kicked out of the hemisphere, and the U.S. took it over for itself. And we can see what has happened. There's a much longer experience in the Caribbean region, but let's just take since the Second World War. Well, according to this thesis, which we are supposed to admire, throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracy in Latin America. So it therefore follows, for example, say to take Ed's example, that when the Kennedy administration organized and laid the basis for the destruction of parliamentary democracy in Brazil, soon to be replaced by a neo-Nazi regime of generals and torturers in 1964, that was an example of our containing a global threat to market democracy in Latin America. Well, in fact, it was indeed described that way, I should say. Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, described the imposition of Nazi-style terror, the word is not exaggerated, as a democratic revolution, a great victory for the free world, the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century, which, here comes the punchline, which should create a greatly improved climate for foreign investment. So there's at least a sort of a partial truth to the statement that we defended market democracies and contained a threat to them. Namely, there was a threat, it's true, an indigenous democratic threat to improve profits for foreign investment, and therefore we overthrew a parliamentary regime and instituted fascist terror. Now, Brazil is a particularly interesting case, actually. First of all, because it's the richest and most advanced country in Latin America with enormous advantages. It ought to be one of the richest countries in the world, enormous resources, no foreign enemies, had the benefit of American guidance and, in fact, control virtually since 1945. And indeed, it is described, or was until about 2 years ago, described as a great success story for American capitalism. I did an interesting book on it by the senior historian of the CIA. I didn't know there was such a position until I read the book. Highly regarded monographic study of how the United States took over Brazil in 1945 and was going to make it a testing area for scientific methods of capitalist development. And then it describes how he did it and how fantastic it was and how it worked out. And writing in 1989, he says this is a success story for American capitalism. We really worked it there. Incidentally, it's not described that way anymore. Now it's described as a failure of socialist statism, because what happened is the whole thing, which was horrible enough at that time, became a total disaster. So now it's a failure of interference with the market. Up till then, it was for 50, 40 years, it was 45 years, it was a success of the capitalist development. And indeed, it is a very interesting case. People talk about this, whatever you think about the Soviet Union, my opinion is they eliminated any socialist tendencies by about 1918. But whatever we think about it, take your choice. If you want to ask, was it successful or was it a failure? Again, if you're sort of semi-rational, the question you'll ask is, how does it compare with other countries that were roughly like that, say in 1915? Same with East Europe in general. I mean, to ask the question that's constantly asked in the West, how does look how lousy East Europe is, look how great Western Europe is. That shows how wonderful we are, how awful they are. I mean, that's a question that doesn't even rise to the level of idiocy. These regions haven't been alike for 6 centuries. East Europe is the original third world, started declining relative to the West even in pre-Columbian times. By the early part of this century, it was a deeply impoverished service area, providing typical third world services to the West. There were countries that you might compare it with. History never gives perfect examples, but there are plausible comparisons that can be made. Like it might be not unreasonable to compare, say, Russia and Brazil, for example, or say, Bulgaria and Guatemala, or that sort of thing. And if you carry out those comparisons, which are the ones that would make sense, it's not really a fair comparison because remember, Brazil had no enemies, was never under attack, had huge capital flow, had the benefit of American tutelage, don't forget, for 50 years. It's now, in fact, in some respects, if you look at Brazil today, or Guatemala, or for that matter, for the Philippines or any of the other countries you might want to compare with Eastern Europe, what you find is it's about the same everywhere. Brazil's a good case. You find about 5% of the population who, in fact, are living extremely well. Western European standards, super rich, maybe even better, maybe 8%, something like that. You find about 80% of the population that's living like Central Africa, and then some in between. In fact, Brazil, one of the richest countries, potentially one of the richest countries in the world, with very nice macroeconomic statistics, one of the biggest growth rates in the 20th century, ranks 80th in the UN development indices, right next to Albania. That's the success of capitalism. In fact, if you compare, say, Guatemala, that's another showcase of democracy and capitalism, we called it, when we overthrew the parliamentary government in 1954 as part of our containing a global threat to market democracies. It was going to be a showcase of democracy and capitalism, you know, pour money in and so on. It's a country which ever since then has been run by guys who could have easily rubbed shoulders with Himmler and Goebbels, always with our support. If you compare it with, say, Bulgaria or Hungary or whatever, or you compare, say, Brazil with Russia, what you find is that for maybe 5 or 10% of the population, the countries that we regard as showcases, for them, they would regard Eastern Europe as awful. For about 80% of the population, they probably regard it as a paradise. Well, is this a success or is this a failure? Well, you know, that's a value judgment. Depends whether you care about the 5% of the very rich people or whether you care about the 80% who are living at the level of Albania, or less, because remember, that's the average. Well, in fact, that's the rational question across the board, and indeed, more general analyses show exactly the same thing. Let me just continue with Brazil, incidentally, is not. You might argue Brazil's a bad example. We didn't do too well there. So you go to Chile or Guatemala or, you know, Philippines. The point is, you take your choice. It's always the same. Can't find an exception to this. This is the pattern throughout. That's the way we've been containing global threats to market democracies. And the bottom line is exactly what Lincoln Gordon, Kennedy's ambassador, said. We are trying to create a greatly improved climate for foreign investment. That's the issue. I mean, if they can do it with parliamentary systems, great. If they can have neo-Nazi murderers, it's okay too. In any event, that's the kind of market democracy we want to preserve. Now, if you look at Latin America as a whole, and remember, Latin America is the place to look at if you ask a rational question about what we've been trying to do, you find some interesting things. The World Bank, in fact, had a study that just came out about 3 or 4 days ago, which on Latin America, pointing out that Latin America had the worst inequality of income in the world. In fact, the World Bank is worried about it. They're not a bunch of radicals, as you may have heard. They were afraid that Latin America is heading for what they call chaos, because the distribution of income is so unequal, so radically unequal, and poverty and misery are so extraordinary that the place is going to go and fall into chaos, meaning even foreign investors may suffer, and that's, of course, what counts. Why is the distribution of income more unequal in Latin America than any place in the world? Is that related to the fact that it has been completely under our control for 50 years and much of it for much longer? Well, if you look at the record, you get some answers to this question. You won't find them in the press, for sure, or even in the scholarly literature, but you can get some answers. You can go back to the period when we were designing the New World Order, the last New World Order, back around 1945, when we took over Latin America, kicked out our rivals, kicked out the British and the French, and took it over. There was the U.S., remember, at the time was extremely powerful. I mean, able to control and dominate much of the world, and in Latin America do basically what it wanted. And there was a debate at that time about how to organize Latin America, very sharp conflict. You read the, I'll just give it to you from the point of view of the State Department. We now have the declassified record. The State Department described the conflict as follows. They said the Latin American countries are dominated by what they called the philosophy of the new nationalism, or economic nationalism, as it was sometimes called. According to to economic nationalism, the dominant idea in these countries, conservative governments and so on, but the dominant idea there was that there should be a broader distribution of wealth, a raising of the I'm quoting now, a raising of the standard of living, and a commitment to the idea that the first beneficiaries of a country's wealth should be the people of that country. Okay, that's the economic nationalism, the philosophy of the new nationalism. Well, the United States was flatly opposed to that. And there was a hemispheric meeting in February 1945 where the issue came to a head. This is planning the New World Order. The U.S. presented what it called an economic charter for America, of which the fundamental idea was, and these were the words, to end economic nationalism in all its forms, meaning give up the idea that the first beneficiaries of a country's wealth are the people of that country, because the first beneficiaries of the country's wealth are foreign investors. If the people of the country can get something from it by what's called trickle down, that's okay. You know, we don't really insist. We're not outright Nazis. Like, we don't insist that they suffer. It's just that that can't be the first priority. As for equality, forget it. That's not even a goal. And you end up with the World Bank report earlier this week. They are supposed to follow market principles. That was made explicit. Brazil, for example, was allowed to develop, but in a way which was complementary to the U.S. economy, meaning they're not allowed to develop in any fashion that might compete with us. They're supposed to do things that we don't want to do, like, or can't do, like produce coffee, or maybe, you know, cheap labor of a simple kind that we don't feel like doing, or something of that kind. They have to be complementary to our economy, and there's good reasons for that. Anyone who's taken an economics course can sort of spill it out. You can prove a theorem, basically, that says, yeah, gives you the optimal efficiency. We do the things we're good at, they do the things they're good at. It happens that what we're good at is, manufacturing and finance and investment and banking and high tech and so on. And what they're good at is picking coffee beans and, maybe doing some simple manufacturing that we don't feel like anymore, and that's the way it has to work. That's a market economy based on the holy principle of comparative advantage. Well, you find, in other short, there are reasons why the situation is the way it is now, and a minimally rational person, I mean a person who is capable of analyzing Soviet behavior and what they were up to by asking, well, what did they do in Eastern Europe? Such a person would have something to say about the thesis that in the past, throughout the Cold War, we contained a global threat to market democracies. Well, so far I haven't really talked about I've only talked about the democracy and a little bit about the market part. Let me go on with that. One might argue maybe this has changed in the last couple of years, like maybe the last decade, which is supposed to be a decade in which we struggled for democracy. Things were different. I won't give you my judgment on that. Let me quote from a more interesting source. One of the people who's done the best, most intensive historical work on this last decade is an interesting person, actually. He's Thomas Carruthers, who's a Reaganite State Department official who was in charge of involved in Latin American affairs, and has recently written both a book and several articles looking at our attitude toward democracy in Latin America in the 1980s, the period when he was in the State Department. And they're good and careful articles and well reviewed and so on and so forth. And indeed, he finds a correlation between U.S. influence and democracy in this decade. Correlation is negative. That is, where U.S. influence was least, democracy did best. So in the southern cone of Latin America, where U.S. influence was least, there was some progress in democracy, which the Reagan administration was strongly opposed to, incidentally, though finally they kind of accommodated to it. In places where our influence was greatest, the achievements of democracy, actually they were, the decline of democracy was the greatest. And that's his conclusion, and he goes on to make a more crucial point, I think, not just the correlation. He says that the U.S. did try to support democracy, and here's the way it did it. I'll quote him. The U.S. adopted pro-democracy policies as a means of relieving pressure for more radical change, but inevitably sought only limited top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structure of power with which the United States has always been allied. Okay? So in other words, democracy is fine as long as it comes out the way we demand, which means that rich sectors allied to Western investors are running the show, and everybody else is out of the game. If democracy can lead to that result, it's fine. If democracy doesn't lead to that result, we destroy it because we have an outcome in mind, and the outcome has to be achieved. Well, that's an accurate description, not just for the last 10 years, but for a long time. And that's the sense in which we have been supporting containing threats to market democracies. Incidentally, what about the threat? So like, was there a communist threat in Latin America? So say, take Brazil in 1945. When we took it over, there was a lot of talk about a communist threat, but as the senior historian of the CIA points out, U.S. intelligence could not find any evidence of any Russian interest in Brazil. Even if they had been able to get in somehow, which is unimaginable, they weren't trying. And so the story continues. The only place where the Russians were ever in Latin America is when we virtually invited them in. So if we decided to attack and destroy a country, like say democratic capitalist Guatemala in 1954, they did quite often turn to somebody for help under our attack. And the place they were going to get help was the Russians. And then, the Russians became a threat. They were interfering with our attempt to overthrow a government. Same way we were a threat to the Russians when we supported the resistance in Afghanistan when Russia invaded it. And I suppose some equivalent of Thomas Friedman and Anthony Lake and so on in communist Russia would in fact have said that we were a threat to them because we were defending targets of their attack. Well, that's foreign communists. What about indigenous communists? Were they a threat? Here an interesting question arises, general question. Well, suppose they were, if we're interested in democracy, what follows from that? However, we need not ask that question because there's a preliminary one, and that is, what's a communist? Well, here the internal U.S. record is quite illuminating. If you look at the declassified secret record of discussion when they talk about this, it sort of tells you the answer, and it tells you that there were plenty of communists. So, for example, Eisenhower and Dulles, back in the 1950s, were deploring the successes of communists all over the place, and Eisenhower was particularly concerned about, these are all quotes, about the fact that they can appeal directly to the masses. And Dulles says, yeah, they have an ability to get control of mass movement, something we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones they appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. So that's the communists. These guys who appeal to the poor, who have always tried to plunder the rich, the big problem of world history, and we can't duplicate it somehow. We are finding it very hard to sell our idea that the rich should plunder the poor. For some reason which we don't understand, they always seem to beat us in this game. Some public relations problem we haven't yet overcome. Well, from this point of view, there's plenty of communists around. So, for example, if a priest is organizing a Bible study group in El Salvador in the 1970s, which is becoming a self-help group or something, he's helping the poor plunder the rich, taking what's rightfully ours and our clients there, and therefore he's a communist, and therefore we send in the death squads. And in that sense, it's quite true that we have been containing a global threat to market democracy, where you remember that market democracy means a climate, a favorable climate for investors. That's market democracy. Top down, if you can get away with it, Nazi murderers if you can't, and containment means stopping these people who are plundering the rich. Now, without continuing, because you can add thousands of examples, and this is really very systematic, there is an interesting fact about our own intellectual culture that comes from considering these questions. I mean, all of this is sort of like trivialities. I mean, these are things that ought to be, there's nothing here that would tax the intelligence of a 10-year-old. These are the questions that would be asked by any intelligent 10-year-old who hears that throughout the Cold War we contained a global threat to market democracies, or who hears some pre-Gorbachev Russian saying throughout the Cold War we contained a threat to people's democracies seeking freedom. First question you'd ask is questions like these. Well, what did you do where you had influence? And the answer is very clear, what you did do where you have influence. And what's interesting about our own society is that nobody can ask that question. That question appears nowhere. It is assumed, it is taken for granted, even more than it would have been in Stalinist Russia, that the doctrine must be true. We were containing a global threat to market democracies, even though the evidence is virtually 100% against it. The question can't be asked. Now, that's an achievement. It's an achievement of our educational system, of our ideological institutions, and so on. In fact, of our whole intellectual culture. An achievement which I don't think could be matched in a totalitarian state. If you look at it comparative level, it can't be matched. And that's impressive, and it's worth thinking about, and it suggests something about the future of market democracy, incidentally. Well, let's stop the drivel about democracy and have a look at the market. The idea that we've been defending a market is at least partially true. We certainly have been defending a market for countries we intend to rob and plunder. We do much better if they have a market system. That means the third world and now Eastern Europe returning to its third world past. But what about us? Well, big story, but let's start with something that's right on the front pages now. The last couple of days, the business sections, not the front page, it's the Wall Street Journal, business section of the New York Times, there's been an announcement of another new Clinton policy in addition to the Clinton doctrine. This is a new national export strategy. The new national export strategy that Clinton announced with great fanfare says that now the Export-Import Bank is going to subsidize exports of U.S. products. Separate from that, there's a side one that says a $3 billion subsidy is going to be given to purchasers, state subsidy, meaning we pay for it, taxpayer subsidy, to purchases of American ships. They say, of course, things like this have been done in the past, but this goes far beyond the less coordinated efforts of the Bush-Reagan administration. Now we're going to have a massive program of state subsidy of exports. Okay? Now they didn't mention that the less coordinated Bush-Reagan program was already in violation of the GATT rules and was condemned, and it was conceded by the head of the Export-Import Bank to be in violation of the GATT rules. Not a secret. But that wasn't enough. GATT, big free trading story, supposedly. Now we're going to go beyond that, and the new export strategy is going to be a much more well-organized, an extreme violation of the principles of economic liberalism. The violations under the Reagan administration, conceded, were part of their general assault on economic liberalism, to which they were radically opposed. Virtually every industrial country has become more protectionist in the last decade or so, but the United States led the way in many respects. With regard to barriers to imports, we in fact did lead the way. It wasn't a big secret. James Baker, when he was Secretary of Treasury, announced proudly that the administration had done more to impose protectionist barriers in favor of American industry than any previous post-war administration, which is quite true. In fact, they imposed more protectionist barriers than all post-war administrations put together. And that's just a marginal part of the state intervention and the violation of the market. The Pentagon, for example, is a huge violation of the market system. That's a major system by which the taxpayer subsidizes high-tech industry, which wouldn't exist unless it was for this enormous subsidy. And we can go on, but that's not enough. Now we have to go on with a new export strategy that violates it even more dramatically. Now, the government and, say, the New York Times concede all of this. They concede, to quote the Times, that we oppose the policies we are now implementing, which, to continue with the Times, these policies we're implementing and which we oppose amount to government subsidies that distort international markets. And therefore we oppose them because we're committed to free trade, but we're implementing them. Well, it sounds a little complicated, but you have to understand the subtleties, which are explained in the next paragraph. It's right for us to violate these principles because that increases, that's a contribution to market principles. Here's the reason, which was actually given by quoting the president of the Export-Import Bank. He says, by creating such a program, the program of government subsidies which interferes with international markets, by creating such a program in the United States, meaning expanding the already GATT-violating program, the Clinton administration will have more influence in seeking international limits on such programs. So, you get it? So by interfering even more radically than in the past with market principles, we already violated GATT principles, but by doing it even more radically, we have more influence on getting others to stop doing Now that's a familiar logic, which you've heard all the time. You know, war brings peace. You know, arms production brings elimination of arms. Crime brings law-abiding behavior, and so on. Standard. Now we see it applied with regard to principles of the market. And there's a simple way of putting it, if you're not a subtle type. The simple way of putting it, anything goes, as long as there's a good answer to the question, what's in it for us? Now, that phrase I also stole from the new Clinton administration, actually from the New York Times report of another aspect of the new Clinton doctrine just a few days ago, namely their report of a White House panel on intervention. Along with the new export strategy and the new Clinton doctrine, there was a White House panel on intervention that met that has been meeting but gave its report last week. And the Times report on this has the highlighted words are, what is in it for us? The conclusion of the panel on intervention is, from now on, anytime there's going to be intervention, we ask, what's in it for us? Okay. Idea is that there's not going to be any more altruism, no more of this good guy business. In other words, we're going to, the kind of altruism that we demonstrated when we turned large areas of the world into graveyards and deserts in Central America and Southeast Asia and so on, that's over. None of that nice stuff. From now on, we just ask what's in it for us. Just as with the new export strategy, where the Secretary of Treasury, Lloyd Benson, nice Kennedy liberal, said when it was announced, I'm tired of these level playing fields. From now on, we're going to tilt the playing field towards us. So no more nice guy. I should continue with the report on the Lake Doctrine, which I only gave part of, U.S. Vision of Foreign Policy Reversed. Here's its essence, as described in the New York Times, Thomas Friedman. With the Soviet nuclear threat gone, where and how we intervene abroad is a matter of choice. In other words, as long as the Soviet threat was around, there was a deterrent. We had to be careful where we intervene. Now we're going to intervene anywhere we feel like. That's the essence of the new doctrine. We will do it in answer to the question, what's in it for us? And with regard to interventions in the market, no more fiddling around. We always violated those principles, but now we're going to tilt the playing field even more in our direction. There is actually a technical name for all of this. It's called the politics of meaning, those of you who follow this stuff. Well, actually, there's nothing new in any of this except greater freedom to do what we've always done in the past, namely radically interfere with market principles and destroy democracy, except for top-down forms that leave the guys who do our business in charge. I mean, that's history. That's the way it works. That's what we've been doing for a long time. In fact, since the origins of the American Republic. We're now much more able to do it than in the past. With the Soviet deterrent gone, according to the new Clinton doctrine, we can now do it anywhere. In the last 50 years, we've been able to do it globally at being a huge power. Earlier, you could only do it around the Caribbean and so on, or on our own, what became our own territory when we exterminated the native population. Now it can be global. That's the new doctrine with these principles. Let's say another word about our attitude toward markets, which is also where we also get kind instruction from places like the New York Times. As you all know, there's a big fuss about NAFTA. And the Times, the corporate press in general, is virtually 100% in favor of what's called a North American Free Trade Agreement. I should say I can't use the words because the only thing that's a North American Free Trade Agreement about the agreement that's proposed is that in fact it applies to North America. It's not free, it doesn't have to do with trade, and it certainly isn't an agreement. Most of the populations of the three countries are against it. But what they call a North American Free Trade Agreement, they want to ram through. This time I'll talk about it. And they know there's a lot of popular objection to it, in fact, overwhelming. So the Times kindly presented us ignorant peons with a primer the other day, front page primer, with I think 300 economists endorsing it, explaining to the stupid masses why it's important to have free trade. Let me stress, this is not what the agreement is about, but let's pretend it is for a moment. Why is it important to have free trade? Well, they explained it to us. Free trade, as they pointed out, their economics correspondent, Sylvia Nasser, wrote the article with 300 economists behind her, all the big shots, guys whose books you read in college and so on, who pointed out that for 250 years it has been understood that free trade leads to a more efficient employment of productive forces. And who but a lunatic could oppose that? Okay, well, since it's been understood for 250 years, it's been understood for 150 years, and that's logic. So therefore, it all applied, say, in the 1820s. At the time, say, when the United States was beginning to develop a textile industry, which is the first industry that anybody forms. So we started building a textile industry, and of course, by these principles, which were well understood, we should do it by free trade because that's the most efficient employment of productive forces. And indeed, it would have been a possibility. I mean, economic historians have looked back at that, say if we had accepted free trade, it would have bankrupted 50% of New England industry instantly, and most of the rest a little down the road. The reason was that British exports were much more efficient. British production at that time was much more efficient. Their comparative advantage, principle of comparative advantage, would have them produce the textiles, not us. But very high protectionist barriers were raised to allow American industry to take off, to begin. That, incidentally, vastly understates the point. King cotton, the source of the Industrial Revolution, was based on cotton production in the South, which involved a number of other rather radical interventions with the free market. One of them, the massacre of the indigenous population, which made the lands available, and second, slavery. That's what helped set off the Industrial Revolution in England, and of course here. And that's the way we got started. Textile industry has spin-offs, like you have to produce things for the textile industry, so you get a little bit of manufacturing and so on, and we gradually got a manufacturing industry. So the story continues without a break. Latter part of this century, of the 19th century, you move to manufacturing and steel and so on. Andrew Carnegie was able to set up the first billion-dollar corporation, surely not by following the principles that have been understood for 250 years, according to the primer. In fact, it was done again behind high protectionist walls to keep out much cheaper British steel, and with ample use of state force, notably in Pennsylvania, where the state militia was called in the National Guard was called in to smash up and destroy workers and unions, to knock down the cost of labor, so that behind the protectionist barriers it was possible to become a big philanthropist, Andrew Carnegie, who's full of philanthropy ever since. Without running through the details, everything else is the same. In the post-war period, the reason we have high technology, computers, electronics, the aeronautical industry, huge industry, all of the things that flow off it, lasers, pharmaceuticals. I mean, take your choice. Every single one of them was developed and maintained with radical interference with market principles through public subsidy funneled through the Pentagon or in some other fashion, and state-guaranteed markets, and ample use of state power to force markets open elsewhere, to conquer, to destroy, to block people, to overcome barriers like the philosophy of the new nationalism and so on. That is one of the invariant, it's one of the most obvious histories of economic, lessons of economic history. It doesn't just apply to the United States, it applies universally, from England up till South Korea and Taiwan. If there's an exception to it, I haven't been able to find it, and no economic historian has been able to propose it. In the last decade, as I mentioned, the rich countries became even more protectionist for all kind of reasons, which is no time to go into, the Reaganites often leading the pack. Well, coming back to what any lunatic should understand, any lunatic should understand that in the 1820s, the United States should have followed these principles that the Third World and we are now supposed to observe, and the result would be that we would be exporting fur and India would have developed an industrial revolution because they were way ahead of us in textiles and ship manufacturing and so on at that time. In fact, they probably would have led the way in the industrial revolution if it hadn't been for British state power. So any lunatic should understand that we ought to today have a world in which, say, India and maybe Egypt and a couple other places that were beginning to develop would have led the way to industrial revolution, and the United States would be exporting furs and maybe manufacturing some little knickknacks if they let us do it, and so on. That's what any lunatic should understand, according to the primer signed by the 300 economists. For some reason, that conclusion wasn't drawn, although it follows quite straightforwardly. And you may ask yourself, why? Well, it didn't quite happen. Say, take India and us. Indian industry, which was substantial in the 18th century, was destroyed by British colonialism by force, and by protectionist barriers and so on. That got Britain's industrial revolution going. The British were quite aware of it. You read all the liberal historians in the early 19th century. They say, yeah, we don't like it, but we've got to do it, otherwise it'll close down all the mills in Manchester and so on. India deindustrialized, became a deeply impoverished agrarian country. England became the leader of the Industrial Revolution, and then other countries followed the same course. Some of them, the ones who were in a position to radically violate market principles, were able to become developed. The ones who were forced to observe them, usually by violence, became the third world. So to take India, you could say there are advantages to this. That is, the lesson taught by the 300 economists is in many respects true, and modern India shows it. The last 7 out of 10 diamonds cut in the world are cut in India. The reason is that there's very cheap labor available, super cheap labor. It's become even more cheap in the last 10 years because India has been undertaking so-called structural adjustment policies, which drive wages down even further and cut down nutrition even further and so on. So by now, cutting diamonds is extremely cheap, and that has a bright side. It's described by one of the main diamond importers who says we pass some of the benefits on to our overseas customers. So the miracle of the market is that workers and their families starve to death in India in the New World Order of economic rationality, but diamond necklaces are cheaper in elegant shops in New York. And that's the way it's supposed to work, and we should have no confusions about that. Well, let me add one qualification. Everything I've been saying is a serious mystification in one crucial respect. I've been talking as if nations are the agents in world affairs, and of course they are not. In any really existing state, to borrow the famous terminology, there's some internal distribution of power and wealth, and state policy reflects that, radically reflects it. So the agents of world affairs, the agents in world affairs are not nations, but those who have power internally within nations, highly concentrated, almost without exception, certainly here. And policy, of course, reflects their interests. Now, this, I'm essentially paraphrasing very closely a famous Marxist revolutionary, Adam Smith, who pointed out 200 years ago that although the policies carried out by the British had grievous impacts on the colonies and were very harmful to the people of England, they were very beneficial to the principal architects of policies in his day, the merchants and financiers. And his point was, if you want to understand anything, you carry out what later came to be called class analysis. Well, that's true then as it's true now. So to continue with the lesson of Adam Smith, again, not one of the ones you're taught when you read Adam Smith, this truism that he pointed out remains the case, and it therefore is a mystification to talk, as I have been talking, as if nations are agents, and as if they gain. Like the United States doesn't gain from policies that are called American policies. A sector gains. The principal architects of the policies and the interests they represent, they quite typically gain. The general population may indeed suffer, and in fact that's a point which is becoming more and more significant, very significant, and in fact it tells you a lot about the future that's coming along. well, let me give, there's only a few minutes, but let me mention just a few of the major things that are happening in international affairs, which have a lot to say about the future of capitalist democracy, or anything remotely resembling it. In fact, I think what it shows is that, that capitalism is even less like, markets are even less likely to function than they ever have in the past, and democracy, which has indeed extended over the years, is probably reversing, and maybe seriously reversing. Since around 1970, and around 1970, the U.S., which runs the show, basically dismantled the international economic system. We're the tough guys, so we set the rules, and the rules weren't benefiting us anymore, so they threw them out, what was called the Bretton Woods system. There have been a number of major consequences of that and related developments at about that time. One of them is an enormous increase in unregulated capital throughout the world, enormous. Another World Bank study about a week ago estimated it now at being about $14 trillion. I confess I have no sense what that number means, but it's enough so that national powerful countries, like European countries, can't defend their currencies. In fact, the European Economic Union was just wiped out because it couldn't withstand attacks from huge quantities of unregulated financial capital, which swamped national or even, supranational economies. Probably the United States couldn't withstand it. So that's one factor that's taken place. A second is that, as you all know, there's been a huge acceleration since 1970, kind of related to this, in what's called the internationalization of production, meaning, you produce in one place and you have your bank in another place and that sort of thing. By now, a UN study on transnationals, again, came out a couple of weeks ago, estimates that just foreign sales of transnational corporations, meaning like sales of US-based corporations abroad, now are considerably larger than all of world trade. Okay, so these are not small factors we're talking about. Furthermore, what is called world trade is in large measure not trade at all. About maybe 40% of it or so is intra-firm transfers. Movement from one branch of Ford Motor Company to another, which happens to cross a national border. But it's not trade in any serious sense. These are centrally managed interactions by huge entities, which are fascist, essentially. There's nothing more fascist than a corporation. Control is totally from above. Orders go down. Nobody has a voice. Anybody on the outside, first of all, is not allowed to know what's going on. And if they did know, there's nothing they can do about it. That's a matter of law and principle. So it's like an extreme form of totalitarianism. They now have assets which generate more overseas sales by a large measure than trade, and the trade itself is, to a significant extent, maybe like a third or 40% or so, just movement among them. Finally, this unregulated capital has shifted in its use quite radically. One of the leading international experts on finance, Cambridge University economist John Eatwell, estimated recently that around 1970, when this whole story began, sort of changed its course. It was going on for a long time, but when it really changed its course, he estimates that about 90% of foreign exchange transactions were devoted to essentially things that are more or less productive, like long-term investment and trade and so on. That's 90% around 1970, 10% speculation. And he now estimates that those figures have reversed. It's something like 10% long-term investment and trade and about 90% speculation, which becomes a lot easier now because with modern telecommunications and so on, you can shift capital, in 2 seconds from one place to another, which is more than the economies of big national states. Well, all of these things have been going on for some 20 years for all kinds of reasons, one of them being the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system by Nixon and several others, and they've had consequences. One consequence is a sharp decline in economic growth all over the world, which is not too surprising if capital is being used for speculation and not for production. And that's happened all over the developed world. A second consequence is that national economic policy is becoming difficult, if not impossible, simply because of the force of unregulated capital and its mass and the size of the transnational corporations and their operations. A third is, and this comes back to Adam Smith's point and why it's so much more relevant today, a third consequence is that the third world model is coming back to the rich countries. A consequence of all of this, in particular, for not subtle reasons, if American corporations can produce, if they can shift their production to high repression, low wage areas, that means that the people who used to produce here aren't going to get jobs or will have to work at the same level, and that means that gradually, not so gradually, in fact, we pick up the third world model. As production becomes internationalized and finance becomes internationalized, as is happening very radically, the third world model comes home. The third world model is Brazil, sharply two-tiered society with a small sector of very wealthy and a huge number of superfluous people. Well, we're a much richer country than Brazil, so it's not going to be like 5% and 80% and some in between, but different proportions. But the model is very clear, and you can see it. You don't have to look at statistics to see it. You take a walk in any city, and it strikes you in the face. There is now, American cities have a definite third world character, so do rural areas. And that's increasing. If you look at the numbers and the statistics, you can see it there, but as I say, it's obvious to anybody with their eyes open. And the reasons are obvious. A large part of the domestic population is now superfluous, just as it's superfluous in the third world. That is, it plays no role in advancing the sole human value. And the sole human value is profit to investors, profit to the rich. Anything else is non-existent. That's the principle. And much of the population is now becoming superfluous with regard to that value, just as it is in the third world, which is why a rich country like Brazil looks like Albania. They're superfluous for production because you can get cheaper and more repressed workers elsewhere, and it's possible that they're becoming superfluous for consumption. I mean, I think that, jury's out on this one, but back in the days of a national economy, say Henry Ford, who pioneered this, understood that you had to pay a sort of a living wage if you wanted to sell Ford cars. It's not so obvious that that's true anymore, because production in a less national economy, that's less true. We don't know how little true, but it may be that production can be produced by highly repressed, like these diamond worker cutters in India and workers in Mexico and so on. And the production can be for the international wealthy. It's becoming an international third world, remember, with two-tiered societies, big sectors of relatively wealthy in the rich countries, tiny sectors in the poor countries, but the split internationally is now becoming much more important, and hence this Adam Smith observation more important. That's very possibly the case. And it's noticed in the business press. So the Wall Street Journal the other day about a week ago, had a front page story which was very enthusiastic. It described an event of, as they called it, transcendent importance, not small. The event of transcendent importance was that wages in the United States were now lower than anywhere else in the industrial world except for England, where Margaret Thatcher had done even better than Ronald Reagan in smashing up the poor and so on and so forth. But they said it's still above South Korea and Taiwan, but we're improving. Pretty soon wages here will be even lower for reasons of the kind I've described, and that's of transcendent importance. Now, and of course it brings about the third world model. The end of the Cold War has accelerated this. It's a crucial fact about it. The Cold War was basically an effort to drive this former part of the third world back where it belongs, and now it's back there. So the economies have been in free fall ever since 1989, and they're roughly back to where they were pre-World War I relative to the West. And that offers new weapons against working people in the West, and that is very well understood. If you read, again, the business press, they're full of it and very enthusiastic. So GM, for example, let me go another 2 minutes and I'll shut up. GM is closing down about 24 plants in the United States. They're already the largest producer employer in Mexico, where they're taking advantage of what's called the Mexican economic miracle, meaning the driving down of wages by about 60% in the last decade to turn it even more into a radically two-tiered third world society than it was before. It offers lots of advantages, but they're also recognizing that they may be able to do as well or even better in Eastern Europe. So they opened last year, GM, a big plant in East Germany where the Financial Times, which is, you know, the biggest and best international business journal, had a big upbeat front page story on how this huge $700 million GM plant, very high tech, where they can get workers for 40% of the wages of the pampered West European workers. Okay, but that's not good enough, because if you go over the border to Poland, you can get workers for 10% of the wages of the pampered West European workers, and they have another article later, very enthusiastic about this, called Green Shoots in Communism's Ruins. Okay, so in other words, everything isn't bad over there. Some green shoots. The green shoots are that as the capitalist economic reforms are imposed, and remember, the third world does have capitalism. They're going to get it down their throats, you know. As the capitalist reforms are imposed, they say, the pauperization of the working class and the massive degree of unemployment are, plus the fact that the government is extremely harsh, you know, and attacks labor organizers and so on, that has created a situation where you have 10% the wages of the pampered Western European workers. So there are green shoots over there. Business Week adds its little version. They say Western workers have to understand that the West is going to have to abandon the luxurious social programs by which the pampered West European workers and American workers have been, you know, allowed to live these, to plunder the rich, in Dulles' words. That's over. Now the supreme value, namely wealth to investors and the rich, that can become, it won't be interfered with any longer by idiotic ideas about people's rights and so on and so forth. We can put that all to the side, have more economic efficiency. In brief, you can put screws on the poor at home and abroad much more efficiently, and it's done in part through big international institutions like transnational corporations and huge banks and so on, but in part by a structure of governing institutions that they themselves are spawning. I mean, the structure, you look over history, you know, the structure of governing institutions coalesces around actual power. So the last couple of centuries, you get national states coalescing around domestic economic power. Well, economic power is a lot more international, so you're getting international institutions. And again, the financial press is quite aware of it. The Financial Times describes what they call the de facto world government that's developing in what they call this new era of imperialism. And they're very happy about it, of course. The de facto world government includes new governing institutions like GATT and the IMF and the World Bank and G7, you know, the rich 7 countries, meaning the executives of the rich 7 countries. That's where NAFTA fits in. This array of institutions this de facto world government has a lot of advantages. One big advantage is completely secret. You cannot know what's going on inside the World Bank, you know. I mean, even if you are willing to spend your life on it and put out the effort, you can't find much. And surely for most of the population, you haven't the foggiest idea what's going on. Certainly you can't find out what's going in a transnational corporation. I mean, that's in principle. They're protected from that kind of knowledge or action. So what you're getting is kind of a very major step forward in a long-term goal of destroying democratic institutions. Democratic institutions have always been regarded as a pain in the neck ever since the British first English democratic revolution. The problem has always been, how do you control the rabble? They seem to be getting rights. Well, there's new ways to do it now. You can move decision-making up to the point where people cannot influence them, do not know about them, and do not know that they don't know about them. The importance of NAFTA, in my opinion, has nothing to do with Perot's great sucking sound, which is probably all total nonsense, but it has a lot to do with an attack on democracy. I mean, this particular version of NAFTA, which is not free and not trade by any means, highly protectionist, which is one reason why U.S. corporations like it, that happens to have the nice advantage of locking into place a particular form of arrangement, locking it in by treaty, so very hard to change, which happens to be geared specifically and with exquisite detail to the rights of investors, with protectionist devices of all sorts and so on, and says essentially nothing about the rights of the general population, labor rights or the rights of future generations, the environment, and so on. They tacked on these so-called side agreements, but if you read them, I have read them, I mean, you know, it's kind of like reading Clinton's health plan. First of all, you can't even figure out what they're about. But when you sort of decode it, it's clear what they're about, namely nothing. You know, they're about setting up boards of businessmen and corporate lawyers who will spend 20 years adjudicating some claim, and then I'll say, okay, business wins. Well, that's this is a new step forward, a massive step forward to eliminating the threat of any form of democracy. Of course, it's another radical interference with market principles, as is trade itself when it's centrally managed. And those are the directions in which things are going. And there's a very good question how long it can continue and what it'll lead to. It's for these reasons that I think there is, in fact, a decline of democracy after many centuries of extension of democracy in the rich countries. And the market, which has always been rather marginal for the rich, is much less of a factor than it ever was. And there are new ways to attack it and to protect the rich from market discipline while imposing it on the poor. That's another part of the two-tiered society. Well, how far can it go? Can you construct, is it possible to construct an international economy on basically the third world model, sort of islands of great privilege, sea of misery, that kind of model, with essentially totalitarian controls with regard to decision making under maybe some kind of facade of electoral democracy, or will popular resistance, which will have to be international in character if it's going to deal with these phenomena, can it somehow dismantle these new structures of domination and violence? It seems to me these are the big questions of the future that one has to think about when we're asking what the likely prospects for democracy are, or for even a survivable existence.
We are containing the West. It presented a challenge to which has required us to defend it. In fact, Professor Chomsky, in his book Deterring Democracy, has a very nice chapter on the Cold War, where he has an excellent discussion of the literature in which it is established that the Soviets, by coming into existence, challenged us. They presented a new idea, they had a potential threat, and therefore many intellectuals and officials have argued that caused us to have to defend ourselves. So everything we did against them, including invading them immediately upon their arrival, was strictly defense. By definition, we were only on the defense. That is straight out of George Orwell. And in fact, the case I am making right at the moment is that the socialist world has been under unremitting attack at all levels. In fact, it was under unremitting military and terroristic attack from the beginning. The Soviet Union itself was invaded before it even existed, and it was attacked subsequently by Hitler in the post-World War II period. As you know, it was encircled, it was under constant military threat, it was under steady military pressure, and in fact the arms race was to a very large extent an American effort that was explicitly designed to impoverish the Soviet Union, to put it under economic pressure as a poorer country. And take all the other socialisms. China, it was attacked immediately after the Civil War. The United States funded the nationalists who were on the Burmese border. They of course protected Chiang Kai-shek. We almost atom bombed China during the Korean War period. So China was under steady warfare. In fact, the Vietnam War itself was considered by China quite plausibly to be a very serious threat to its national security. The great power across the ocean was attacking its neighbor It was a national security threat. We have had the most marvelous capability of seeing national security threats everywhere to us, but whatever we do, surrounding other countries, attacking their neighbors, and is not plausibly a threat to them. They should understand that we are people of goodwill. There also, of course, there have been continuing efforts also at subversion, the use of black propaganda, buying politicians and military personnel. The most famous cases are the ones that I've always been most fond of are Brazil and Chile. In Brazil, the United States practically took over the country, buying newspapers, buying politicians on a huge scale before 1964, buying the army, and the further question, what is socialism? Most socialists would agree that socialism cannot be an authoritarian or totalitarian order, that it must include a fully democratic mode of political governance. It must also include community and worker ownership and control of major producing assets. And it must embody a strong policy thrust toward both equalitarianism, inclusiveness, and libertarianism. The really existing socialisms have generally not met the first and parts of the second and third conditions. They have been bureaucratic and centrally controlled by a self-appointed vanguard and not libertarian. Their versions of socialism has involved mainly state ownership and control and an equalitarian thrust, plus some socialist rhetoric that was often hypocritical and Orwellian. So the answer to the first question is that a case can be made that socialism has never been tried. The defeated socialisms were at best imperfect socialisms. At worst, they were perverted versions. They were also, however, under steady pressure and sometimes fierce attacks from the West, which weakened the possibilities of improvement. Which brings me to my second question. Why did the really existing socialism suffer such defeat? Of course, very important factors were the conditions under which they arose. Almost all the socialisms of the world came in rather poor countries. They came frequently after wars. They were countries that were not particularly well developed. They were economically. They were countries that had traditions that were not democratic traditions. And so when these governments came into power, these socialist governments came into power, they were always in distressed circumstances. They were always having to recover, to try to mobilize the population to development and to simple recovery. And they had very little managerial talent. And of course, all these things were badly exacerbated by the fact that the West was hostile to them from beginning to end. The force of that hostility, I think, has been greatly underestimated. In fact, in the West, it's a principal idea that has been fostered for many years is that the West has been on defense against socialism. Socialism has been a threat. Police and ultimately succeeding in getting subversion realized in a military coup that we were really essentially part of. The same thing was true in Chile. We've also carried out continuous economic warfare against all the socialist powers, the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Guatemala, Cuba, Nicaragua. The design of these efforts by the West have been to force increased arms expenditures, to weaken these countries economically, and to force them into the Soviet bloc, to create fear and to curtail liberty. In effect, what we were trying to do all the time was to engage in a self-fulfilling prophecy. We prophesied that these countries were non-libertarian. We were going to darn well help make them non-libertarian. And We wanted them to be Marxist-Leninists, so we would force them into the Soviet camp by boycotting them. Then we would be proving that they had these Marxist-Leninist tendencies and were affiliating with the Soviet Union. We did that time and again. Very important to understand that these efforts of the United States in reference to countries like Nicaragua or Cuba or Guatemala were never to democratize. They were always to destabilize and destroy. We just did not want social democratic and socialist countries. So while we might be attacking Nicaragua for years on the ground that we wanted a more democratic Nicaragua, nobody with any sense whatsoever could possibly fall for that nonsense. We had supported Somoza for 45 years. The same government was proclaiming a deep interest in democracy in Nicaragua, was kindly supporting Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, anybody you might name. So the hypocrisy was absolutely mind-blowing. And the reality was clearly that the Sandinistas represented some Oxfam study called a threat of a good example. It was an alternative way of organizing economic life. It was not even really socialism, but social democracy. We couldn't bear it. So we used all the means at our disposal to eliminate that threat. Admittedly, the leaders and the bureaucrats of the Soviet bloc countries performed poorly and lost the respect of their own people, and much of this happened independently of Western policy. But the West exacerbated the worst tendencies of these deficient socialisms, and when they showed signs of some positive changes, the West took advantage of these, in the case of the Eastern Bloc, with the assistance of significant parts of the old bureaucracies in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, to destabilize them and pull them quickly into the Western orbit. In cases like Vietnam, Nicaragua, Guatemala under Arbenz, Chile under Allende, and Juan Bosch's Dominican Republic, even social democracy was never given a chance, but was actively destabilized or attacked. I think it is very greatly underrated the extent to which the triumph of the market and what Clinton is now calling market-based democracies, which are not very democratic, depended on sheer force, violence, and terrorism to achieve their final ends. Does socialism have a future? It's hard to be very optimistic given the recent defeats and the power of the global market system and its enforcers. But there are these several important threads of hope. One is that the market-based democracies are increasingly serving a small elite and marginalizing the majority of people. They're creating what we might call a global reserve army of labor and uncared-for people. They are our market, and we have to be prepared to serve them. Furthermore, the fundamental principles of the triumphant market economy, that is, possessive individualism, competition, the profit motive is the dynamic of the system, and its basis on enlarging consumption and growth continuously, are incompatible with ecological and environmental reality and human survival. As they fail in these regards, our market will swell further. In an important sense, therefore, the triumph of socialist values is a condition for human survival. This should give us an additional incentive to keep our ideas in play. It even constitutes a kind of moral imperative. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, like our first recipient, as I forgot to mention, is a native of Philadelphia. Dr. Noam Chomsky received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. Many of us first learned of him and his work during the Vietnam War, when he was a very early and very outspoken activist and critic against the war in Vietnam. He's the author of many, many books, only a few of which are listed here. Let me not. Herman taught for many years at the University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School. Prior to that, he taught at Penn State University. He's written many books, some of which are listed on your program. There's many others that you're probably aware of. He currently edits the magazine called Lies of Our Times, which he brought us some sample copies. Anybody would like to take one. He also writes regularly for Z Magazine, one of the better magazines in America. And he's currently, or in the last year or so, he's taught some courses on media analysis at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And maybe best of all, he's also a member of our group, which is always nice to have. So first we'll have Dr. Ed Herman to accept the award and give us a little message here tonight. Dr. Herman?
I'm a tall guy. I need this loose. Thanks very much, Bob, and I'm very pleased to be the recipient of the award and to be getting it here with my esteemed colleague, Noam Chomsky. My talk tonight is addressed to the question of, does socialism have a future? Socialism has suffered some very severe blows, as you are all aware, in the last few years. Virtually all the world's regimes and experiments that have called themselves socialist have been defeated or removed from power by external or internal political and military processes. This has been a very serious setback for socialists, social democrats, and leftists everywhere. It has terminated experiments that, whatever their weaknesses, many of us had hoped might strengthen over time. It's weakened the barriers to the great capitalist powers' military economic assaults on socialist and social democratic outcroppings in the Third World. And it's badly damaged socialist and left morale and spirit of hope. This set of defeats raises three questions that I want to discuss briefly here. One, was it socialism that was defeated, or systems so far removed from socialism that the word is not at all applicable? Two, why were the really existing socialisms defeated? And finally, is socialism finished, or does it have a future? To answer the first question, in fact, to answer all of them, we must first answer the